Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's pretty straightforward. We are diving headfirst into one of the most famously misunderstood regions of the entire wine world, Beaujolais.
Hmm.
And when I say misunderstood, I mean that in the most literal sense possible.
It's so true. When you just mentioned the word Beaujolais, the reaction is almost always the same, isn't it?
Yeah, you get a smile.
You get that slight smile, maybe a little laugh. You're talking about the wine world's eternal underdog. It's the wine that feels like a reliable Ford instead of some dazzling Ferrari.
Right. It's fun, it's approachable, but nobody seems to take it quite seriously.
Not at all.
And that perception is, frankly, it's wildly erroneous. It's a perception that just completely undercuts centuries of struggle, incredible resilience, and then eventually this overwhelming commercial triumph.
It really is the story of an underdog. A peasant wine that somehow achieved a level of worldwide name recognition it's really only rivaled by champagne.
Which is an incredible statement when you stop to think about it.
It is. So, to set the table, I think we need to establish the geography immediately. Beaujolais is a place. It's an irregular rectangle of land, about 60 kilometers long and maybe 15 wide.
It's sort of framed by Macon to the north and then the great city of Lyon to the south.
Exactly, the gastronomic capital.
Mhm.
And the region itself is named after its old capital, a town called Beaujais.
But it's not just one wine. This is so critical. It produces 12 distinct wines. This is the first thing we need to burn into your memory right away.
It is. You have the generic Beaujolais, then you have the slightly more refined Beaujolais villages, and then you have the 10 crus, the growths.
And those crus are where the real story is, where the quality just shines.
Oh, absolutely. Brouilly, Côte de Brouilly, Chenes, Cherouble, Fleury, Juliennes, Mordaunt, Moulin-Lavant, Renier, and Saint-Amour.
Each one with its own personality.
Completely. They are so much more serious than the playful reputation of the region suggests. You can't just lump them all together.
Right. You get this incredible complexity. You're talking about the muscle and depth you find in a Great Morgan or a Moulin-Lavant, and then you contrast that with the ethereal elegance, the perfume of a Fleury.
Exactly. But the central story we want to tell is how this poor, downtrodden country endured centuries of official disdain to somehow conquer the global market.
And if we're going to talk about modern Beaujolais, we are fundamentally talking about one man who engineered that conquest.
Georges Duboeuf.
Yeah.
The man they called the King of Beaujolais.
And his inseparable partner, the Gamay grape. So here's the actionable insight for you, the listener. If you can fully understand why this region and its top crusts have been historically undervalued, and it's due to nothing more than centuries of administrative and historical bias, you start to realize something.
You realize that Beaujolais is possibly one of the great investment secrets in high-quality French wine today.
Exactly. And we are going to shortcut you to that understanding. We're going to trace its violent exile and its relentless, centuries-long fight for survival. Okay, so let's start with the literal foundation, the terroir, and why the Gamay grape found its absolute perfect home right here.
And to do that, we need to go back 50 million years. We have to talk about the Great Alpine Folding.
Right, tectonic activity. It's what always determines the fate of wine, isn't it?
It really is. So when the Great Alpine Folding pushed up the Alps, the Earth's crust gave this kind of massive secondary shrug, which fractured the eastern edge of the massive central.
And that fracturing created this series of rocky north-south wrinkles, which we now know as the Mont du Beaujolais. It's a really dramatic landscape.
It is. If you're driving north from Lyon, you see these steep, abrupt slopes that just descend right toward the Saône plain.
And that geography, of course, defines the soil. The northern Cru zone, where all the best wines are found, is almost entirely granite.
Almost entirely. It's composed of granitic rock, schists, and this very specific pink-hued blue stone. And this geology is it's absolutely crucial.
Why? Because of drainage.
That's a huge part of it. The granite provides excellent drainage, which forces the Gamay vines to dig deep, really deep, for nutrients. It's a poor soil, which paradoxically forces the vines to work harder.
And that concentrates the flavor in the grapes.
Exactly. Meanwhile, if you go down to the southern Beaujolais, which produces the lighter, more generic wines, that sits on limestone and clay. It's a much richer environment.
Which is why you get the higher yields you often see in, say, a generic Beaujolais or a Beaujolais villages.
Right. And there's this wonderful little detail that illustrates just how well the early inhabitants understood this. The ancient town of Beaujolais, the historic capital, was deliberately placed at the bottom of a cleft where the soil was poor for growing grapes.
They were saving the good stuff for the vines.
They were saving the prime, sun-drenched, mineral-rich slopes above the town entirely for the vines. From the very start, care for the wine was just the most logical economic priority.
So that brings us to the grape that defines the region, Gamay. And Gamay's identity is not really defined by where it initially flourished, but by where it was violently and publicly exiled from. Burgundy. And the executioner was a very powerful man, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy.
Youngest son of King John II. He wielded quasi-royal authority, and he issued an edict on July 31st, 1395, banning the cultivation of Gamay from his entire northern domain.
That sounds incredibly dramatic, but why? Was it just, a quality control issue?
It was purely protectionist. It was driven by economics and, frankly, snobbery. Pinot Noir was the prestige product of Burgundy, perfectly suited to the clay limestone terroir up there.
And Gamay, by contrast, was what they called overproductive.
Exactly. It was easier to grow, it was less sensitive to the soil, and it produced huge quantities of juice. That meant more wine for far less work for the peasants.
So the average farmer could produce much more wine from Gamay than from the highly finicky, low-yielding Pinot Noir.
Right. And Philip the Bold saw this flood of cheap, easily produced Gamay as a mortal threat to Burgundy's whole reputation, which was built on rarity and high quality.
He didn't want his brand diluted.
Not at all. In Burgundy's climate and soil, the Gamay wine of that era was seen as coarse. The words they used were bitter, acid, and thin, especially compared to the deep, complex, age-worthy character of the best Pinot.
So he demanded that this vile and noxious grape, as he called it, just disappear from his lands.
That's the quote. And that single decree essentially cast Gamay southward near Macon and directly into the granitic haven of Beaujolais, where it found its perfect partner in that schist and bluestone.
And that action defined Beaujolais' identity for centuries. It became officially codified as sub-Burgundy, with its wines just casually dismissed as, base and vulgar.
And the irony is just so deep, because modern DNA research confirms this was all a family drama.
Oh.
We now know that Gamay, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir all descend from the exact same two parents. A prototype Pinot and a much older, lower-quality grape called Gouais Blanc.
So Philip the Bold was essentially trying to ban his own cousin.
He was trying to rewrite the family tree through administrative fiat. And that inherent sense of being shoved out of the noble northern lands, it fueled the region's desire for recognition. It gave birth to some wonderful folklore.
Like the legend of Claude Brosse around 1700.
Ah, Claude Brosse. The mythic commercial Robin Hood. The tale says he was a vigneron from the Macon Beaujolais area and reportedly a giant of a man. He was just so frustrated by the high tolls and duties imposed by the Burgundy merchants.
So he loaded up his large ox cart.
And he began a 33-day trek northward, hauling his wine, cleverly avoiding or, just bluffing his way past Burgundy's toll houses and customs sheds until he reached the absolute pinnacle of French power. Versailles.
I love this story. The climax is when he parks his massive cart right outside the royal chapel during Sunday Mass.
Right. And when the king's master of ceremonies sees this rustic giant and just shrieks at him to kneel, Brosse, speaking in his thick, earthy patois, rumbles back, "Well, ain't I on my knees already?" referring to his great height.
It's a perfect line. And the story goes that the king, charmed by this rustic audacity, samples the wine, loves it, and orders it served at the royal table.
And what stands out to me is that whether this story is strictly factual or not, it doesn't matter. It's essential Beaujolais folklore because it's a celebration of the underdog.
The humble peasant who triumphs over provincial confinement and wins recognition from the highest authority in the land.
It is the absolute spirit of the region. But the reality for most of the 18th and 19th centuries was much, much grimmer than the Brosse legend suggests. We have to contrast Beaujolais sharply with its wealthy cousins.
Burgundy and Bordeaux,
which were built on powerful clerical or aristocratic land holdings. Beaujolais was the smallholder wine country par excellence.
Can you elaborate on that smallholder status? I mean, how did that differentiate their economic life from, say, a big landowner in the Medoc?
Well, until very recent times, we're talking post-World War II, the Beaujolais peasants were primarily subsistence farmers. They grew grain, they tended animals, they produced cheese, all just to survive.
And wine was just a side hustle, essentially.
It's an aleatory cash crop, something speculative, totally dependent on the weather to provide a little bit of liquid capital.
That relentless poverty, it really defined the character of La France profonde, the deep, obscure rural masses whose lives were just defined by this punishing, penurious existence.
And this persisted right up until the economic boom years, Les Trente Glorieuses, after the war. And that subsistence farming mentality had a direct effect on the wine quality during that era.
Of course, if you're a subsistence farmer, your focus isn't on aging potential or complexity.
It's on yield and survival. You sell the wine quickly to meet your immediate needs. And that means the historical profile of Beaujolais was defined by young, simple, quaffable wines, not the serious crus we see today. It perfectly sets the stage for just how difficult it was to even keep the vines alive in the face of all the natural disasters to come.
So, moving into the 19th and early 20th centuries, the life of a Beaujolais vigneron was just defined by sheer, relentless physical labor and this constant fight against disaster.
It was a true sentence of hard labor, year after year. The vigneron was up before dawn, tending to the animals, working the vineyard all day, sustained by very, very little.
And they weren't drinking the good stuff.
No way. The good wine was way too valuable. They had to sell it. Instead, they drank piquette, or vin de repas.
Which, for listeners who haven't heard the term, was basically just the repressed dregs mixed with water. It was thin, acidic, and offered only a slight alcoholic nudge.
Maybe 4 or 5 degrees, just enough to get you through the day, but certainly not enjoyable.
And the physical demands imposed by the terrain were just legendary. I mean, we have accounts from vignerons like Papa Brichard, a folk historian who described the work as coolie work.
Erosion on those steep granitic slopes was a constant existential threat. It created these deep gullies.
And the effort required to fight that erosion just sounds almost impossible to sustain.
It was all manual backbreaking work. Whenever a storm washed the topsoil away, it had to be brought back up. Vignerons would shovel the lost earth into what they called hots.
Wickerwork baskets, right, like a huge trough you carry on your back.
Exactly. And these baskets could hold up to 50 kilos or 110 pounds of earth. They would haul these loads back up the steep hills on their backs, sometimes needing to crawl on all fours on the steepest sections.
Just to maintain a layer of arable soil for the vines.
This was the annual, repetitive, unrewarded cost of farming on quality land.
It sounds absolutely medieval. And then on top of that, there was the hidden danger inside the cellars during the harvest.
Oh yes, the process of vinifying the grapes involved bringing them into these vast, deep tuns. The standard practice was to trample them in the costume of Adam, as the source puts it, to start the fermentation.
Naked.
Right. And the problem is that the carbon dioxide gas rising from the fermenting is completely undetectable. It's heavier than air, and it settles right at the bottom of the vat.
So a lone worker just descending into the vat could be overcome instantly.
Instantly. It could asphyxiate a worker as surely as a sudden blow to the head. Papa Brichard recounts that there were victims every single year during the harvest season.
So this combination of intense physical labor and ever-present danger just defined the life of the Beaujolais smallholder.
It did. But even before the great international plagues arrived, Beaujolais had its own local disaster. The pyrrole, or mischievous worm.
A caterpillar.
A caterpillar and moth that devastated vineyards in the mid-19th century, leaving just widespread desolation.
But this brings us to Benoit Raclais, a genuine Beaujolais savior, though he was initially dismissed as a complete lunatic.
He was. Raclais noticed one single vine near his house that continued to flourish, and it was right next to the drain pipe where hot water from his wife's daily chores was dumped.
And he made this radical deduction from a very simple observation.
He realized the scalding hot water was killing the hibernating larvae of the pyrrole caterpillar, which were hiding under the bark of the vine during the winter months. So he set about experimenting.
With a boiler and a coffee pot.
Exactly. The source describes him looking like a 19th century Professor Gadget. And he was met with just ridicule and hostility. People thought he was insane for scalding his own vines.
But his labor-intensive method worked. It was a bizarre, local, temporary triumph over a pest.
Temporary is the key word. Because the real existential crisis came from across the Atlantic. This was the arrival of the American Triad of Terror.
3 catastrophic pests that arrived via transatlantic cargo ships. First, 2 fungal diseases. Oidium,
Powdery mildew.
and mildew.
Downy mildew. These forced the very first widespread use of chemical intervention in European viticulture.
And the solution to the mildews was, again, it was accidental, and it was found in Bordeaux.
Yes. A botanist named Millardet noticed vines near a schoolhouse that seemed magically resistant to mildew. And it turned out they had been treated with a mix of copper sulfate and slaked lime.
But not to protect them.
No, it was applied purely to make the grapes look unappetizing, to deter local children from stealing them.
So the children deterrent became Wheely Bordelais, Bordeaux porridge.
A mixture of copper sulfate and slaked lime that remains the most widely used fungicide in the world today. You'll still see that characteristic turquoise or blue-green hue on the leaves.
And early vignerons applied it with immense difficulty.
Oh, they carried 50 pounds of the gear in metal tanks on their backs, using these simple mop-like applicators or just broom sprigs, laboring under the hot sun. It was an innovation born of necessity, but just another massive burden of labor.
But the mildews were merely the precursors. They were the opening act for the ultimate destroyer, the tiny aphid Phylloxera vastatrix,
which arrived around 1876, marching inexorably northward through France. It was a disaster on a scale unmatched since the Middle Ages.
And the irony here is just staggering.
It is. The Phylloxera bug arrived attached to hardy American vines that had been imported specifically because they were resistant to oidium, the mildew that was also from America.
So the cure for one American pest delivered the mechanism for the ultimate second American pest?
Exactly.
And what was the immediate effect on the Beaujolais vineyards?
The devastation was complete. Over its 20-year infestation, Phylloxera, which just sucks the sap right out of the roots, it made a tabula rasa of the traditional wine industry.
It was worse than the Black Plague.
For vines, absolutely. Because it wiped out the entire economic engine of the land.
And what were the desperate measures the peasants tried to fight it?
Oh, they tried everything based on superstition and sheer will. They dug deep around the vines and scrubbed the trunks and roots by hand using chainmail gloves.
Completely useless.
Totally useless against the aphid. They even tried flooding entire vineyards for extended periods where geography allowed, hoping to drown the pest.
But the chemically expensive and incredibly dangerous solution was carbon disulfide?
Yes, Vermerel's injector rod. It allowed them to squirt the highly toxic carbon disulfide directly into the ground. It was effective against the Phylloxera, but just so dangerous for the worker.
Because it's highly volatile.
Extremely. Old-timers recounted stories of muddle-headed vignerons, forgetting how volatile it was, lighting up a pipe or a cigarette for a break nearby, leading to sudden fires and explosions. The cure could easily kill the vigneron along with the bug.
But the salvation, perhaps fittingly, came from the source of the problem. It was a vigneron from Chiroubles in Beaujolais, Victor Pouliot.
Yes, a very dedicated man who realized the answer was staring everyone in the face. The imported American vines were naturally immune.
He realized that the European Vitis vinifera couldn't survive on its own roots anymore.
But the American root system was impervious. So his proposed solution was the binary plant, or la méthode Pouliot. You physically graft the European scion, the gamay plant, onto the resistant American rootstock.
It was a monumental decision. It required the wholesale destruction and replanting of vineyards across the whole of Europe.
But Pouliot's intuition proved absolutely correct. The American roots didn't impart the dreaded foxy taste of the American vines. The character came entirely from the European gamay scion.
And this single act saved the entire European wine industry.
It is so vital for you to grasp the scale of this intervention. Virtually all French vines today, from the most humble Van Tabel to the grandest Chateau Petrus, grow on American rootstock.
The annihilation and replanting also allowed for a degree of modernization, didn't it? It rationalized the chaotic, overcrowded vineyards that had previously been planted en fell in a throng.
It could. And so, as the vignerons fought the soil, the pests, and the weather, the science world was also providing the intellectual framework for modern winemaking.
Right. We need to acknowledge two key French scientists who really underpinned this revolution.
First, Louis Pasteur. He provided the ultimate rationalization for hygienic winemaking. He famously demonstrated that wine is a highly clean drink, healthier than water in many places.
And he proved that fermentation is a biological process involving yeast, and that exposure to oxygen leads to undesirable microbes that cause spoilage, turning the wine into vinegar.
His work provided the foundation for cellar hygiene and techniques to protect the must from oxygen.
And second, there was Count Jean-Antoine Chaptal, a doctor and chemist whom Napoleon named Minister of the Interior. In 1801, he advocated for the process that's now named after him, chaptalization.
Chaptalization is such a critical concept, and it's so often misunderstood. It's the process of adding carefully calibrated amounts of sugar to the newly pressed grape juice, before or during fermentation.
And the purpose is not to sweeten the finished wine.
Absolutely not. The added sugar provides extra food for the yeast. When the yeast converts that sugar, it produces more alcohol, boosting the final alcohol content of the wine.
Which is critically important in temperate zones like Beaujolais, where the sun can't always be counted on for optimal ripeness.
Exactly. A slightly higher alcohol content helps the finished wine become rounder, more balanced, and more stable. It improves its quality immensely.
So it's about refining and balancing the product of a difficult growing season. It was initially a refinement of an ancient peasant practice, but it was viewed with suspicion by some.
Accused of being an artificial adulteration. Yet, without it, in many, many vintages, Beaujolais would simply be too thin and acid to enjoy. Chaptal essentially took a necessary improvisation and turned it into a scientific, codified, and repeatable method, ensuring minimum quality standards can be met even in a challenging climate.
So, given this backdrop of centuries of hard labor, poverty, scientific catastrophe, and, administrative disdain, how did this downtrodden and despised wine achieve worldwide massive name recognition?
The story begins and ends with Lyon, the gastronomic capital of France.
It's the essential relationship. The author Léon Daudet famously wrote in 1927 that Lyon is served by three rivers: the Saône, the Rhône, and the Beaujolais.
Which never dries up and is never muddy. This quote just perfectly captures the zeal of Lyon for its local wine supply.
Beaujolais became integral to Lyonnais identity precisely because it was reliable, plentiful, and inexpensive. It was the perfect, humble partner for working-class gastronomy.
This is the world of the bouchons, the iconic, unpretentious working-class bistros.
And the machon.
The machon, from the verb mâcher, to chew. It was an extra serious breakfast eaten by workers like the famed silk weavers, the canuts between their early morning shift and their midday lunch. It was essential for sustaining the energy needed for that kind of grueling labor.
And what kind of food fueled this ritual?
We're talking about humble, rib-sticking poor man's nourishment. Dishes that utilize the less glamorous parts of the animal.
Like tablier de sapeur.
Which is breaded ruminant stomach, often large enough to resemble a sapper's apron, or Grattan's glorified crunchy pork fat bombs. This honest, simple cuisine was always accompanied by a pot of Beaujolais.
A pot being the standard bar wine glass, traditionally measuring about an eighth of a pint. It was a social ritual built entirely on affordability.
Absolutely. Now, the Lyonnais discovered centuries ago that the new vintage could be ready only about 2 months after the harvest. And the arrival of this new wine, the primeur, was eagerly awaited.
Why?
Because by the end of the summer, the barrels in the drinking places were often oxidizing, turning sour, losing freshness. They needed a fresh supply.
So, by common accord, November 11th, St. Martin's Day, became the unofficial date.
It did. Bar owners and merchants would ritually trek north into the Beaujolais countryside to buy barrels of the new wine. And for nearly 300 years, this was strictly a local Lyonnais eccentricity.
But everything changed after the Second World War. What was the first key domino to fall toward commercialization?
It was bureaucratic, as it so often is. In 1951, French tax authorities finally rescinded wartime rules that had prevented early sales. This allowed some wines, the primeurs, to be sold earlier.
And that was the first tentative step for the primeur to enter the formal bottled retail circuit.
It was. But the trend needed a global stage. And this is where the Parisian connection sealed Beaujolais' fate.
Parisian journalists, exiled during the war years, found themselves in Lyon.
Exactly. And they discovered this vibrant Lyonnais habit, spending time philosophizing over countless pots of Beaujolais. They were part of groups like the Société des Amis de Guignol, who organized the immensely popular Concours de Meilleurs Pots.
A competition to find the best over-the-counter Beaujolais.
Right. And when they returned to Paris, they imported the custom and the competition wholesale. And the timing was just perfect for the capital.
Because mid-November in Paris is notoriously gloomy. The long summer vacation is a distant memory. The weather is lousy.
And the city desperately needs a collective distraction from the autumnal blues. The arrival of the new, fresh, fun wine became that perfect distraction.
And what the cynical, jaded capital took to with such enthusiasm, the rest of France and eventually the world would follow.
The smallholder vignerons, many of whom were just one generation removed from those hard-scrabble days of subsistence farming and carrying hots of soil, just rubbed their eyes at the explosion in sales figures.
But the person who truly weaponized this trend was Georges Duboeuf.
The explosion of Beaujolais onto the world stage and the creation of this global wine event, it simply would not have happened without Georges Duboeuf. He truly is the king of Beaujolais, even though his start was deeply humble.
And his origins weren't even technically Beaujolais, is that correct?
That's right. He came from old, sober, hard-working farming stock in the Mâconnais, specifically the white wine village of Chantray, which sits right on the Beaujolais border. His family lineage runs deep, dating back to at least AD 1500.
And after losing his father young, he and his older brother Roger worked fiercely, tirelessly, just to keep the family patrimony intact.
They did.
Well,
But he didn't initially plan on being a vigneron. He almost left the wine world entirely for a brief career change in the capital.
right, he trained to be a chiropractor.
A masseur kinesiothérapeute, a
Yeah.
sports trainer, or chiropractor. He spent 2 months training in Paris, but the experience was just miserable for him. He found the big city stifling.
The commute.
He described the daily 2-hour commute on the bus and metro as the ultimate stress. He realized the urban life was not for him, and he swiftly returned to the familiar rural rhythm of Chantray.
And his career as a courtier, or wine scout, the middleman who buys, blends, and bottles the region's best wine, that began with an act of pure principle in 1951.
He was only 18 years old, and he was absolutely frustrated that local wholesalers were diluting the quality of his perfect Cueilly Frisé. So he made this incredibly bold move.
He got on his bike.
He stuck 2 bottles into his blue bicycle's tote bag and pedaled 10 kilometers to Toisé to meet Paul Blanc, the famous 2-star chef at Le Chapon Fin.
That's the culinary equivalent of knocking on the door of the New York Times food critic.
It really is. And the great chef tasted the wine, and impressed by the quality and the boy's gumption, he just growled, "Petite, I'll take your white wine. And if you can find me some reds as good as this, I'll take them too."
And that was the unintended launch of Duboeuf's career. He realized the only way to ensure quality was to control the process himself, bypassing the unreliable wholesalers.
So Georges and his wife Rolande soon moved their base to Romanèche-Thorns, which is strategically positioned between the prestigious Cru Moulin-à-Vent and the main highway, the M.6.
And he immediately began innovating, not just in process, but in presentation.
He patented a graceful little bottle, the pot, which was instantly popular in the restaurant trade for its elegant shape and functional size. But perhaps the most telling early failure was his attempt at organized cooperation.
Right. He tried to create a cooperative in 1957 called Le Crème Mâconnais Beaujolais with 45 vignerons. Why did it collapse, even though they were commercially successful for a few years?
It was a testament to the fiercely independent, individualistic nature of the Beaujolais smallholder. The source explains the collapse was due to endless jealousies and suggestions of favoritism,
Every single vigneron in the co-op was in love with his own wine.
and insisted that his particular batch be promoted and sold first. The idea of collective branding or equal effort was simply rejected.
It was impossible.
Duboeuf realized the task of managing this querulous pack of Gallic artists was impossible. He resigned in 1961, recognizing the core truth of the region. Vignerons would always want to be first.
So from then on, he focused on being a world-class négociant, buying the best wine from the best individuals.
And he became famous for that solo pursuit of quality, the marathon taster. His tasting process was ceaseless, obsessive. He barreled through thousands of vignerons, barrels, and batches every single year.
And he had to develop this uncanny ability and a prodigious power of memory.
To judge the finished wine, the final product, from just sampling the runoff juice early in the fermentation process.
And his personal habits just highlight his dedication.
Absolutely. He woke up at 4:30 a.m., 4:15 a.m. before his 70s, starting his day before the sun was up to cover maximum ground. And he always insisted on drinking tea, never coffee.
Because he believed coffee blunts the taste buds.
It compromises his critical judgment. When asked if he had ever been drunk, his answer was reportedly just stony. No, of course not. His lifelong mantra was that wine is for health and pleasure, not for drunkenness, that rigor was the core of his success.
But the other half of the success was marketing. It was revolutionizing presentation. In the wine world, innovation often happens in the vineyard, but Duboeuf's biggest marketing move happened with a bunch of flowers.
It's a great story. In 1970, he was traveling in London, and he saw this simple bouquet of violets, daisies, and cornflowers in a hotel. And this image, combining simplicity with brightness, it just struck him as the perfect visual metaphor for Beaujolais.
Fresh, vibrant, and joyful. And he translated that directly into his signature labeling.
He commissioned an illustrator to create the famous, instantly recognizable floral labels. Before this, French wine labels were notoriously boring, dense, businesslike.
Just the bare minimum information.
Exactly. Duboeuf broke the mold, introducing an entirely new genre of eye-catching, consumer-friendly labels that have been endlessly copied worldwide.
Yeah.
This marketing shift was just crucial for globalization.
And then came the inevitable consequence. Duboeuf became the world champion of Beaujolais Nouveau. By the mid-90s, the new wine accounted for over 60% of basic Beaujolais and half of Beaujolais Village's production.
And he was a master of inexpensive, effective public relations. Instead of hiring expensive celebrity endorsements, he utilized the Compagnons du Beaujolais.
Simple vignerons and folkloric costumes, black jackets, green aprons.
They were the visual representation of the authenticity he was selling. They traveled the globe, performing these quasi-ethnographic exhibits, handing out free samples, singing their drinking songs, and just showcasing this country bonhomie.
It was charming, unpretentious, and a highly effective way to market the rustic joy of Beaujolais to a global audience that was frankly tired of stiff, formal French marketing. So the global craze for Nouveau created this massive media sensation, but it also rapidly descended into, well, absurdity. We have to detail the London madness of the annual Beaujolais Nouveau run.
Oh, it was wild.
Yeah.
This started innocently enough in 1970, initiated by a couple of rivals in London, Joseph Berkman and Clement Freud, as this jovial boast.
Yep.
Who could get the first bottle of Nouveau from Beaujolais to London first?
And it quickly escalated into a full-blown anarchic competition.
Which attracted the truly eccentric. It was pure foolishness, generated incredible press, and it became this yearly spectacle. You had a red Jaguar XJS, which Berkman himself drove at 225 kilometers per hour.
He barely survived a collision with a semi-trailer.
You had teams in kilts, a Danish Formula One driver, and perhaps the most memorable, the team in a white Bentley Continental who drove wearing full gorilla suits.
Gorilla suits driving a Bentley to deliver a bottle of wine. That is the kind of absurdity that guarantees global headlines.
It certainly reinforced the unshakable Gallic conviction that the British were mad as hares. But the race successfully generated massive international publicity for the Primera concept.
It was too anarchic to last, though. Why did the race ultimately end?
A combination of law enforcement and rationalization. Scotland Yard cracked down hard on the illegal street racing aspect. At the same time, the INAO, the French regulatory body, rationalized the process.
They allowed early shipping.
By November 12th, to distant overseas markets like Japan and Canada, provided those markets guaranteed no cheating. The need for a dangerous, illegal cross-channel race just disappeared.
But success bred cynicism, didn't it? The spectacle and the sheer quantity of Nouveau being produced allowed critics to quickly dismiss it as half-made wine, which led to a significant backlash that persists today.
And this leads us to the fundamental issue of Beaujolais' persistent undervaluation, which was really administrative and historical. Experts like Frank Preil and Michel Bétain argued that Beaujolais was fundamentally underrated because of centuries-old snobbery.
They trace it directly back to Philip the Bold's decree, correct?
Absolutely. The hierarchy established centuries earlier by Burgundy négociants, based on the premise that Gamay was an inferior cépage, it resulted in an economic trap. It meant that even the top, age-worthy crus, like Moulin à Vent and Morgon, were priced far too cheaply.
Sometimes on par with the simplest premier wine.
Which is insane. If a top cru, which requires complexity and time, is only marginally more expensive than a wine designed to be drunk 2 months after harvest, the economic model is fundamentally broken.
Bétain specifically called it a monstrous error.
He did. He argued that selling a Moulin à Vent for only 20 or 30% more than a Premier was economically illogical, as the quality differential was just massive. This administrative insult kept the region poor and defined its reputation, despite the soaring quality of the top wines.
And this internal pressure and external criticism eventually led to a major crisis, the affaire Leon Mag in 2002.
Sales were flagging, and the region was sensitive. Leon Mag, a local publication, published this inflammatory headline that cut right to the core of the region's pride. Beaujolais, it's not wine.
Using the phrase vin de merde.
Literally shit wine. And the Vignerons responded emotionally with a lawsuit.
63 regional trade groups sued Leon Mag for denigration. They felt their pride and their livelihood had been deeply wounded.
But they ultimately lost in the French Supreme Court on freedom of expression grounds. It was a high-profile, emotional exercise that totally backfired, giving undeserved honor to the magazine and making the region look overly sensitive.
And then, following this very public setback, Duboeuf himself faced legal trouble in 2004 with a high-profile fraud accusation. This requires some careful analysis.
The company was accused of manipulating and mixing batches of wine, which is a breach of AOC rules. Specifically, they were accused of blending higher-value crus into lower-value batches, like Beaujolais villages in the 2003 and 2004 vintages.
Now, the source makes it clear that while Duboeuf himself was declared innocent of personal fraud.
His company was fined 30,000 euros. And what was so interesting was his response to the fine. This is where his character becomes clear.
Right. Rather than appeal and prolong the legal battle.
Duboeuf chose to swallow the fine. And critically, he then downgraded all the litigious wines one notch. Crus were sold as Beaujolais villages, and Beaujolais villages were sold as simple Beaujolais.
So he took an immense financial hit, essentially selling a superior product at a depressed price.
Exactly. Because the wines had actually been ennobled by the mix. They contained higher quality components than their label suggested. Customers got an incredible deal.
And Duboeuf kept his honor intact by taking the punishment and prioritizing the consumer's experience over profit. It was a masterful, if costly, market maneuver that saved his reputation amidst a legal storm.
And this whole tension just highlights the complexity of the French appellation system, the AOC, run by the INAO. The goals were laudable, weren't they? They were trying to prevent the kind of fraud that was rampant after Phylloxera, ensuring quality based on terroir.
The goals were essential for protecting the integrity of French wine, but the result was a model of labyrinthian complexity that completely failed the ordinary consumer.
The INAO, in its earnest attempt to do too much too well, created a parochial canon for specialists, but entirely neglected the common buyer.
Can you just demonstrate that level of complexity for us? You mentioned those incredibly specific Volnay names earlier.
Imagine trying to explain to an average consumer the difference between a Volnay first-growth Clos de la Rougeot and a Volnay first-growth Fermier Clos de la Rougeot. These are microscopic geographical differentiations that only a highly specialized local expert would understand.
The INAO defined thousands of tiny parcels based on ancient land ownership, creating a hierarchy that was utterly meaningless to the market.
And this complex parochial AOC system is now being run commercially in circles by the simple, easy-to-understand varietal system used by New World producers.
The simple label that reads Chardonnay or Gamay from Australia or the US or New Zealand is a commercial powerhouse over slow and complicated French geography.
And Beaujolais is paying the price for a system that was designed to prevent 19th century fraud, but is ill-equipped for 21st century globalization.
And the troubles continued locally. One of the most distressing points in the sources is the sense that the French themselves, specifically the Lyonnais, have largely abandoned Beaujolais.
It's been described as the breakup of a love affair. Many Lyon bars now serve Côte du Rhône instead, which is seen as a kind of implacable pout against the local wine. And the question is, why did the locals abandon their cherished tradition?
A major unavoidable factor was public safety. Starting after 1972, draconian new French traffic laws, le tout répressif, or the entirely repressive system, were implemented.
And they dramatically reduced road deaths. But this had an enormous, unintended economic consequence for Beaujolais.
The constant real threat of breathalyzer checks stopped the ancient custom of tasting in caveau in cellars, and most importantly, having wine with lunch.
The old ways of drinking with ethyllic abandon, a glass of Nouveau at the Marchand, tasting samples with the producer, they were just no longer possible.
You see the direct economic impact in places like the Cave Co-op in the village of Quincy-en-Beaujolais.
Sales there were reported down 20% over 5 years because their caveau used to be packed on Sundays with people coming to drink and talk and socialize. Now, customers come, they quickly buy their wine and don't even taste it for fear of the police waiting down the road.
It's an unavoidable economic reality resulting from necessary public safety improvements. The region's identity was historically tied to a culture of consumption that is simply no longer permissible.
So if we look back at the Beaujolais region, what we see is centuries of unrelenting hard labor. The carrying of 110-pound hots to counter erosion, the lunatic solution to the pyrrole, the near annihilation by Phylloxera,
And the administrative insults endured by the Gamay grape at the hands of its Burgundian neighbors.
Yet, that resilience, combined with the rationalizing force of Georges Duboeuf, has resulted in some of the highest quality, most terroir-expressive wines the region has ever seen. The Gamay grape in the granitic soil of the Crus is performing better than ever.
And the modern vigneron ethos, in the face of intense global competition and internal strife, is one of unwavering dedication. Georges Duboeuf's mantra remains travail, rigueur, qualité.
Work, rigor, quality. It is the necessary formula for survival.
And Marcel Pariaud, the quintessential smallholder who still occasionally plows his fields with his workhorse Herman because he loves the partnership, he sums up the rural determination perfectly.
Les plus courageux survivront. The toughest ones will survive.
And this brings us full circle to our starting point, value. The enduring historical and administrative bias against Gamay means that today, Beaujolais Crus are arguably the best value in high-quality French wine.
Frank Pryl, the American wine critic, was adamant that the Crus Moulin-à-Vent, Morgon, Chenas offer the best deal.
And we have specific evidence for that, don't we? We noted the anecdote of the experienced wine expert who mistook a high-quality 2003 Moulin-à-Vent for a top-flight Hermitage or Burgundy in a blind tasting.
That prejudice is what keeps the price relatively low while the quality just soars.
So when you pick up a bottle of a great cru, you are buying into centuries of overcoming adversity. As Georges Duboeuf says, le vin est la mémoire du temps.
Wine is the memory of time. Despite all the technological change and globalization, the tradition of the Beaujolais smallholder remains the anchor of the region's identity.
And you should consider that final evocative image of Marcel Pariaud, the plowman, ex-mayor, and winemaker after his harvest feast. Instead of playing taps on his army bugle, he gives the sleeping village one last nocturnal serenade.
He chooses to play Reveille, the call to wake up. Beaujolais is not finished. It's waking up to a new reality defined by serious quality, not frivolous new wine. The core message we hope you take away is that historical perception rarely keeps pace with current quality.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. What long-held perception or tradition in your own life, whether it's about a product, a place, or a person, is fundamentally due for a bugle call and a fresh start? Is there a belief you hold that, like the Gamay grape, has been unfairly exiled or diminished by an ancient, outdated edict? Something that deserves a second, deeper dive.